Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm your host, Mike Huckabee, and I'm joined by our device obsessed senior sales engineer, James McCarthy. Hi, James. And today's topic, the world of medical devices. We are more and more seeing our world through all of the devices that we are using. And sometimes we're even substituting real things for devices as well, as you can see in this picture of the guy walking his dog.
It's a very rare Chinese breed.
And now we've got things like smartwatches, step counters, heart monitors, blood pressure sensors, all of these things that we continue to live with day in and day out. And many with the promise that it'll improve our lives. There's a huge concern about the rapid growth and what that might mean about our ability to trust the devices, to trust the manufacturers of the devices, to trust how the devices are being used, and to trust how we as security professionals are actually managing and working with those devices day in and day out. We use the term life critical devices to talk about those types of devices that could, if not managed appropriately, have a negative impact on a human. Something like an infusion pump that is going to be connected into you, a human, and is also connected to a network and also has a little brain inside of it. And these, imagine, can be prime targets for ransomware. And to top it all off, there are cameras everywhere. Those can be very prime targets in a very sensitive and privacy concerned environment. So we have some common issues here. The first is of fear around managing these things that might be life critical at scale. Another big concern that I'll bring up is how these devices are actually manufactured. So we've seen instances of different vendors creating devices, but using common firmware from a third party. So this might help them to scale or accelerate their ability to go to market. Now you're having to start thinking about, well, downstream, where do I need to trust the people that are actually creating some of the firmware? So I'll just show this from Health and Human Services weighing in. 60% of all medical devices that they look at today are unpatchable. They're at the end of the life. They have no security patches or upgrades available. Do we wait until it breaks? Do I have the visibility to understand what devices that I have that may be end of life? What devices actually are patchable? Which ones are not patchable? We need to understand this information so we can make good decisions on being able to manage these devices.
This is the device that we're going to be talking about here. This is a B-Bron infusion pump. This is a device that sits next to a patient in a hospital room, and as you can see here, actually delivers medicine. The idea of a device that's intelligent, that's making decisions for medicine delivery into your body is already a little bit intimidating. You've got something like an Apache web server that's running on this device, or you've got like FTP or SSH that's sitting dormant but accessible on these devices, sitting on the brains of the machine. Thankfully, Phosphorus is here to help solve some of these problems and to help secure this industry and help bring these kind of more into a more secure posture. So you can see here, this B-Bron specifically has not only vulnerable firmware, so this has something that's got actual vulnerabilities that we know that are publicly known, that are published for that firmware version, but it also has things like vulnerable SSH server. That's, to me, a huge red flag, right? What we found is something interesting about these B-Bron devices is they actually have patient information built into them. So the bed number, right, patient IDs, things like that exist in the firmware of this device. This is the firmware, like I mentioned. This one specifically has a lot of known vulnerabilities associated with it, right? So when you look at this as a life-critical device in a hospital, I don't like seeing that many CVEs associated with that device. And what's really weird about these devices, and I think is kind of fascinating, is the data, the actual brains of this device isn't in the device itself, right? The B-Bron, the pump itself, is really just a shell. It's just a bunch of screen. It's a screen with a bunch of buttons. The data and the firmware actually lives on the battery of this device. Hospitals have a challenge with actually tracking these devices, because what they think they're tracking is the shell, and they think they're tracking this whole BBRON device. But when somebody goes in there and tries to swap out a battery because they want to do an upgrade or they just want to recharge the unit, they're actually swapping out all of the settings. They're swapping out the firmware, and that's something that doesn't normally happen in most of these environments. Mike, you had said earlier, this concept that we can discover firmware that's almost shared across different vendors. The reason why that's a big problem is if a BBRON is using third-party firmware under the hood, and BBRON comes out and says, hey, we know that there's a vulnerability that's out there in the wild for this version of our hardware. It's the BBRON Spacecom version X. That's great. And a hospital system might have a good enough inventory system to be able to go in and find that specific model of BBRON and do a patch of some sort, right? But what happens if there's another manufacturer using that same firmware that also has that vulnerability, but that manufacturer is not as good about their communication? We're understanding what's going on under the hood. So then when we know that there's a vulnerability associated with that firmware version, we're letting you know regardless of the manufacturer, regardless of the device itself.